The morning air was cold against Helena's bare feet, the kind of cold that sank into the bones and refused to let go. She stood in the yard outside her family's hovel, dirt clinging to her toes, her threadbare dress doing little to shield her from the wind that swept down from the northern hills. The sky above was gray, heavy with the threat of rain, and the world smelled of damp earth and desperation. Her father's voice rose and fell in frantic rhythm, each word tumbling over the next as he gestured wildly at the man before him. The Alpha King's tax collector stood with his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark cloak embroidered with the royal crest, a silver wolf's head set against a field of black. His eyes were the color of iron, and they held no warmth, no mercy, only cold calculation. "Please," her father said, his voice cracking, "please, she's all we have left to offer." Helena watched from the edge of the yard, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had known this moment would come. It had been inevitable from the first time her father mentioned the debt, from the first time her mother looked at her with that mixture of pity and resentment. She was 22 years old. She had never shifted. She had no mate. In the eyes of her pack, in the eyes of her own blood, she was worthless. The collector's gaze slid over her, slow and dismissive. He took in her small frame, her pale skin, the way she held herself so still it was as if she were trying to disappear entirely. His lip curled. "A wolfless girl?" He barked a laugh, sharp and bitter. "You expect me to bring this to the king? What use does he have for someone who can't even claim her own beast?" Her mother flinched at the words, but she said nothing. She stood in the doorway of the hovel, her hands wringing the edge of her apron, her face drawn tight with shame. Helena had stopped expecting comfort from her years ago. Her father stepped forward, desperation leaking into every line of his body. "She has a voice," he said quickly. "She sings beautifully. She could entertain the king's guests, couldn't she? Surely that's worth something." The collector's eyes narrowed. He looked at Helena again, this time with a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or pity. It was hard to tell. "She sings?" he repeated flatly. "Yes," her father nodded so hard his neck seemed likely to snap. "Like an angel, I swear it. Just listen to her once, please." The collector sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked at Helena, and for the first time, she met his gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't lower her eyes. She had nothing left to lose. "Sing," he said. Helena's throat tightened. Her hands trembled where they clutched the small, worn hymn book she had been holding since dawn, the only thing she owned that mattered. It had belonged to her grandmother, the only person who had ever truly loved her. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and soft from years of being turned by gentle, weathered hands. Inside were hymns passed down through generations, songs her grandmother had sung to her in the dark when the rest of the world had turned its back on her. She opened the book, though she didn't need to. She knew the words by heart. Helena drew in a breath, and she sang. The melody rose into the cold morning air, soft at first, then growing stronger. It was a hymn of endurance, of quiet faith in the face of impossible odds. Her voice was clear and pure, each note carrying a weight that seemed to still the wind itself. Even the birds in the trees fell silent. Her father watched with something like hope flickering in his eyes. Her mother turned away, unable to look. And the collector? He stood motionless, his expression unreadable. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was heavy. The collector exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll take her." Helena's father sagged with relief. Her mother let out a choked sound that might have been a sob. But Helena felt nothing. No relief, no fear. Only the cold, hollow certainty that her life as she had known it was over. The collector gestured sharply. "Get your things." Helena looked down at the hymn book in her hands. "This is all I have." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's go." There were no goodbyes. Her father didn't embrace her. Her mother didn't weep. They simply watched as the collector took her by the arm, not roughly, but firmly, and led her toward the road. Helena didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth remembering. The journey to the palace stretched on in silence. The collector walked ahead, his strides long and purposeful, and Helena followed a few paces behind. She clutched the hymn book to her chest like a shield, her bare feet aching against the rough stones of the road. The wind picked up as they traveled, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. She had heard stories of the king's palace all her life. A fortress carved from black stone, towering walls that scraped the sky, halls lit by 1,000 candles. A place of power and beauty where the strongest wolves in the realm gathered to serve their alpha king. She had imagined it once, when she was younger and foolish enough to dream. She had pictured herself there, not as a servant, but as someone who belonged. Now, as the palace came into view, rising from the hills like a monument to everything she would never be, Helena felt only the weight of reality pressing down on her. The gates were massive, iron and oak bound together with chains as thick as her wrist. Guards stood on either side, their faces hidden under steel helms, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The collector nodded to them, and they stepped aside without a word. The gates groaned open, slow and deliberate. And Helena stepped through. The sound of the gates slamming shut behind her echoed through the courtyard. Final and absolute. Helena stood in the shadow of the palace walls, the hymn book pressed against her heart, and she realized with cold, unshakable certainty there was no going back. Only forward, into whatever darkness waited inside. The collector led Helena through the outer courtyard and into the belly of the palace. The walls here were stone, cold and unyielding, and the air smelled of old smoke and something sharper, sweat, fear, the residue of countless lives lived in servitude. They descended a narrow staircase that spiraled downward, the light from the torches growing dimmer with each step, until finally they emerged into a low-ceilinged corridor lined with doors. The collector stopped before one of them and knocked twice. A moment later, it swung open to reveal a woman with a face like weathered leather and eyes that could have been shipped from flint. She looked Helena up and down with the same dismissive efficiency as someone appraising a sack of grain. "This is the new one?" the woman asked. "She sings," the collector said. "The king's household can find use for that. Or not. Either way, she's yours now." He turned and walked away without another word, his boots echoing down the corridor until the sound faded entirely. Helena stood alone before the woman, clutching her hymn book, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though there was no kindness in it. "My name is Arya," she said. "I run the servant quarters. You'll do as I say, when I say it, without question. Understood?" Helena nodded. "Good." Arya stepped aside and gestured into the room. "Get in." Helena crossed the threshold into a dim, cramped space that smelled of lye and damp cloth. There were other women inside, 3 of them, all younger than Arya but older than Helena. They looked up as she entered, their faces blank, their eyes dull. None of them spoke. Arya shut the door behind her with a heavy thud. "Strip." Helena's breath caught. "What?" "You heard me." Arya's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "You're filthy. Strip. Now." Heat rose in Helena's cheeks, but she knew better than to protest. Slowly, her hands trembling, she set the hymn book down on a rickety wooden table and began to pull off her dress. The fabric was threadbare, stained, but it was hers, the only thing she had left from her old life. When it fell to the floor, she stood in nothing but her shift, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at modesty. "That, too," Arya said, nodding toward the shift. Helena hesitated, but one look at Arya's face told her there would be no mercy here. She pulled the shift over her head and let it drop. One of the other women, a girl with dark hair and hollow eyes, stepped forward with a bucket of water. She didn't look at Helena, didn't acknowledge her. She simply dumped the contents over Helena's head. The water was freezing. Helena gasped, her body seizing as the icy shock drove the air from her lungs. She staggered, her teeth chattering, her skin prickling with goosebumps. Another bucket followed, then another. The water pooled at her feet, dark and cold, and the women scrubbed at her with rough cloths, their hands efficient and uncaring. They didn't speak, didn't meet her eyes. It was as if she weren't a person at all, only an object to be cleaned. When they finally stopped, Helena stood shivering, her hair plastered to her skull, her body numb. Arya tossed her a bundle of cloth, rough, gray, shapeless, a servant's dress. "Put that on, and don't expect anything better. You're at the bottom here, girl, the lowest of the low. You'll work until your hands bleed, and if you're lucky, you'll live long enough to grow old and bitter like me." Helena pulled the dress over her head, her fingers clumsy with cold. The fabric was coarse, scratching against her skin, but it was dry. That was something. Arya stepped closer, her eyes hard. "You'll do as you're told. You'll keep your head down. You'll speak only when spoken to. And if you're smart, you'll learn quickly that survival here is not guaranteed." Helena met her gaze and said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Good," Arya said. She turned and opened the door. "Now get to work." The days that followed blurred together into a haze of exhaustion and pain. Helena was assigned the dirtiest, most back-breaking tasks, scrubbing the great hall floors on her hands and knees until her skin was raw, hauling buckets of water up narrow staircases that seemed to stretch on forever, emptying chamber pots, washing linens stained with things she tried not to think about. Her body ached in ways she didn't know were possible. Her knees were bruised, her palms blistered, her back a knot of constant grinding pain. But she didn't complain, she didn't cry, she simply worked. The other servants barely acknowledged her. They moved through their tasks like ghosts, silent and hollow-eyed, and Helena quickly learned that this was how you survived. You kept your head down, you didn't ask questions, you didn't make friends. The palace was not a place for warmth or connection. It was a place for endurance. At night, Helena collapsed on a thin straw mat in a cramped room she shared with 3 other girls. They never spoke to her, never looked at her. They simply lay in the dark, breathing in the rhythm of exhaustion, and Helena stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about how far she had fallen. But when the silence grew too heavy, when the weight of everything threatened to crush her, she would reach for the hymn book tucked beneath her mat. She would run her fingers over the worn cover, and she would sing. Softly, so softly that no one else could hear. Just a whisper of melody in the dark, a thread of sound that connected her to the only person who had ever loved her. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo in the notes, gentle and steady, and for a few precious moments, Helena was not alone. It was the only thing that kept her sane. But then, on the 4th night, the whispers began. Helena was scrubbing the floor of the servants' corridor when she heard them. Low, furtive voices drifting from the room where the other female servants gathered to eat their meager evening meals. She paused, her brush stilling in her hand, and listened. "They say it's happening again," one voice said. "The king's guest chamber?" another replied, her tone laced with fear. "Has to be. Why else would they summon us tomorrow?" Helena's heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, her breath held. "I heard a girl went in last month, never came out," the first voice continued. "That's not true," a third voice said, though it sounded uncertain. "She came out, but she was different. Wouldn't talk about it, just stared at the wall and cried." "I heard it's not even a guest," the second voice said. "I heard something lives down there, something that isn't quite wolf." "Stop it," the third voice hissed. "You're scaring me." "You should be scared," the first voice said. "We all should be." Helena's hands began to tremble. She set the brush down carefully, quietly, and moved away from the door. Her mind raced. The king's guest chamber. She had heard the name whispered before, always in hushed tones, always with a kind of dread she didn't fully understand. But now hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the fear in the voices of women who had survived this place longer than she had, something cold settled in the pit of her stomach. She returned to her mat that night, but she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and she thought about the rumors. About the girl who went in and never came out. About the thing that lived in the chamber. About the fact that tomorrow they would all be summoned. And somehow, deep in her bones, she knew. Her name was going to be called. The morning came too quickly. Helena woke to the sound of Arya's voice ringing through the corridor, sharp and commanding. "All female servants to the grand hall, now." The other girls in Helena's room stirred, their movements sluggish and reluctant. They exchanged glances, brief, flickering things, but no one spoke. They simply rose, dressed in their gray servant garb, and filed out into the corridor. Helena's hands were shaking as she pulled on her dress. She tucked the hymn book into the folds of her skirt, a small act of defiance, a talisman against whatever was coming. Then she followed the others. The grand hall was vast, its ceiling arching high above them, supported by thick stone pillars carved with images of wolves in mid-hunt. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. And at the far end of the hall, a long table sat empty, its surface polished to a dark gleam. And before it, standing in a line, were all the female servants of the palace. Helena took her place at the end of the line, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and she knew that she wasn't the only one who was afraid. Arya stood at the front of the hall, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, and then from the far doorway, a figure emerged. He was tall, impossibly tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light. His hair was dark, cropped close to his skull, and his eyes were a pale, icy blue that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone. He wore the insignia of the king's beta on his chest, a silver wolf's head that gleamed in the torchlight, and his presence filled the hall like a storm. The servants stiffened. Some of them lowered their gazes, others trembled where they stood. But Helena didn't look away. The beta walked down the line slowly, his gaze sweeping over each girl in turn. He studied them with the cold efficiency of a predator selecting prey, and one by one, they wilted beneath his stare. Until he reached Helena. He stopped. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Helena met his gaze, not with defiance, not with fear, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had already accepted the worst. The beta's eyes narrowed. He tilted his head slightly, as if seeing something in her that the others didn't possess. Then he lifted one hand and pointed. "You," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, and it echoed through the hall like a death knell. "You. Prepare yourself. Tonight, you serve the king's guest chamber." The hall fell silent. Helena's blood ran cold. The beta's finger remained pointed at Helena, unwavering, and the silence in the grand hall stretched taut as a bowstring. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, could feel the eyes of every servant boring into her back. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, somewhere near the front of the line, a girl let out a soft, strangled sound, half gasp, half sob, and the spell broke. Whispers erupted like a brush fire, low and furtive, spreading through the line of servants. Helena caught fragments of words. The chamber. Poor thing, she won't last. But she didn't turn to look. She kept her gaze fixed on the beta, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The beta lowered his hand. His expression didn't change. He simply looked at her for a moment longer, as if committing her face to memory, and then he turned and strode from the hall without another word. His boots echoed against the stone floor, each step deliberate and final, until the sound faded entirely and the heavy doors swung shut behind him. Arya stepped forward, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "The rest of you, back to work. Now!" The servants scattered, their movements quick and jerky, like rabbits fleeing a predator. Within moments, the hall was nearly empty. Only Helena remained, standing alone in the center of the vast space, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Arya approached her slowly, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost conversational. "Well, that's that then." Helena swallowed hard. What is it? The king's chamber guests, what's in there?" Arya's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though there was no warmth in it, only cold, bitter amusement. "You'll find out soon enough." She tilted her head, studying Helena the way one might study an insect pinned to a board. "You won't last the night." The words should have terrified her. They should have sent her to her knees, begging for mercy. But Helena had stopped believing in mercy a long time ago. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met Arya's gaze without flinching. "Then I suppose I'll see you in the morning. Or I won't." Arya's smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Brave words, girl. Let's see if you still have them when the sun sets." She turned and walked away, her footsteps sharp and purposeful, and Helena was left alone. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Helena moved through her tasks like a woman in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She scrubbed the floors of the great hall until her knees ached and her hands were raw, hauled buckets of water up flights of stairs that seemed to stretch on forever, emptied chamber pots and washed linens until her back screamed in protest. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the whisper she had heard. The girl who went in and never came out, the one who returned with scars like claw marks, who stared at walls and cried. The thing that lived in the chamber. Something that isn't quite wolf. What did that mean? What could be worse than a wolf? Helena didn't know, and the not knowing was almost worse than the fear. As she worked, she sang, softly, under her breath, so that no one else could hear. The hymns her grandmother had taught her, the ones that spoke of endurance and faith, and the quiet strength it took to survive in a world that didn't want you. The melody was a lifeline, something to anchor her when everything else felt like it was slipping away. The other servants avoided her. When she passed them in the corridors, they looked away, their faces carefully blank. When she entered the servants' dining hall to collect her meager meal of bread and thin soup, the room fell silent. The girls she shared a room with packed their belongings and moved to another space without a word, as if proximity to her might be contagious. She was already a ghost. Aria's words echoed in her mind. "You won't last the night." Helena sat alone in the cramped room that was now hers and hers alone, the hymn book open in her lap, and she stared at the fading light through the narrow window. The sun was setting. The shadows were growing long. And soon, Aria would come. She thought about running. The palace was vast, full of corridors and hidden passages. Surely there was a way out. Surely she could slip through the gates, disappear into the forest beyond, and never look back. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. Where would she go? Back to her family who had sold her like livestock? To another pack where she would be just as unwanted, just as worthless? There was nowhere for her. No one who would take her in. And besides, some part of her, some small, stubborn part, refused to run. She had survived her family's cruelty. She had survived the sneers and the whispers and the cold, brutal indifference of this place. If she was going to die, she would do it on her feet, not cowering in the bark. So, she waited. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the room filled with shadow. Helena lit a single candle, its flame flickering weakly in the draught, and she closed the hymn book. She ran her fingers over the worn cover, one last time, tracing the lines her grandmother's hands had traced 1,000 times before. "Give me strength, please," she whispered into the darkness. The knock came just as the last light faded from the window. Helena's heart leapt into her throat. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and crossed to the door. When she opened it, Aria stood on the other side, her face half illuminated by the torch she carried. "It's time," Aria said. Her voice held no softness, no pity, only cold, flat certainty. Helena nodded. She stepped into the corridor, pulling the door shut behind her, and followed Aria into the depths of the palace. They walked in silence. The corridors here were narrow, the walls pressing in on either side, and the air grew colder with every step. The torches were fewer and farther between, their light weak and flickering, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Helena's breath came shallow and quick. She tried to steady it, tried to calm the frantic pounding of her heart, but it was no use. Fear was a living thing inside her, clawing at her ribs, whispering that she was walking to her death. Aria didn't look back. She simply walked, her torch held high, her footsteps echoing off the stone floor. They descended a staircase, steep and winding, spiraling down into the bowels of the palace. The air here was damp, heavy with the smell of earth, and something else, something wild. Helena's will stirred for the first time in years, a faint, uneasy tremor at the edge of her consciousness. But it didn't emerge. It never did. But it was aware. And it was afraid. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom of the stairs. The corridor here was different, wider, but somehow more oppressive. The walls were lined with iron sconces, each one holding a torch that burned with a low, sullen flame. And at the end of the corridor, set into the stone like the entrance to a tomb, was a door. It was massive, taller than any door Helena had ever seen, its surface black and smooth, bound with iron bands that gleamed dully in the torchlight. There were no markings on it, no crest, no sign of what lay beyond. Only silence. Aria stopped a few paces from the door and turned to face Helena. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been pity, or regret, or simply the ghost of her own fear, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. "You'll find everything you need inside. Bucket, brush, cloths. Do your work, keep your head down, and whatever you do, don't anger it." Helena's mouth was dry. "It?" Aria didn't answer. She simply turned and walked back the way they had come, her torch bobbing in the darkness, until she disappeared around the corner, and Helena was alone. Helena stood before the door, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. She could hear it now, the sound that had been lurking at the edge of her awareness since they descended the stairs. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic, inhuman. It came from the other side of the door, low and steady, like the rise and fall of the ocean, like the heartbeat of something vast and terrible. Helena closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother, of the hymns, of the quiet strength it took to endure when the world wanted you gone. Then she reached out, placed her hand on the cold iron handle, and pushed. The door swung open with a low, groaning creak, and Helena stepped inside. The door closed behind Helena with a sound like a tomb, sealing a heavy, final thud that echoed through the chamber and seemed to reverberate in her very bones. For a moment, she stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the cold iron, her breath caught in her throat. The chamber was vast, far larger than she had expected. The ceiling arched high above her, disappearing into shadow, and the walls were lined with rich tapestries that depicted scenes of hunts and battles, wolves running beneath full moons, their eyes gleaming with a life that seemed almost real. The floor was stone, polished smooth by time, and scattered across it were thick rugs woven in deep reds and golds. At the far end of the room stood a bed, massive, draped in dark furs and silks, large enough to hold 3 wolves comfortably. But it was the light, or the lack of it, that made Helena's skin prickle. Only a few candles burned, their flames weak and guttering, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls like living things. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something wild, something that reminded her of the forest after a storm, wet fur and moss, and the faint metallic tang of blood. And then she saw them. Eyes, glowing, amber, unblinking. They watched her from the far corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, and they did not move. Helena's breath hitched, her heart slammed against her ribs, and for a moment she thought her legs might give out beneath her. But she forced herself to stand, forced herself to meet that gaze, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. The eyes did not blink, did not waver. They simply watched. And then, from the darkness, came a voice. "Get to work." It was low, deep, a growl wrapped in words, each syllable rough and guttural, as if the speaker's throat were not built for human speech. The sound of it crawled across Helena's skin, raising every hair on her arms. She swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the edges of her skirt. But she forced herself to move, to obey, because what else could she do? She turned away from the eyes, away from the voice, and scanned the room. There, near the door, she found what Arya had promised, a wooden bucket, a stiff bristled brush, and a stack of cloths. She crossed to them on legs that felt like water, her movements slow and careful, as if any sudden motion might provoke the thing in the shadows. She knelt beside the bucket, dipped the brush into the water, and began to scrub. The stone floor was cold beneath her knees, and the water was colder still. Her hands ached almost immediately, the rough bristle scraping against her already raw palms. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She focused on the task, on the rhythm of the brush against stone, on the sound of water sloshing in the bucket. Anything to keep her mind from the thing watching her. But it was impossible. She could feel its gaze on her back, heavy and unyielding, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched. Helena's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Her chest felt tight, her throat raw, and the fear that had been clawing at her since she entered the chamber began to bleed into something else, something she couldn't control. A melody. It started as a hum, barely audible, trembling and uncertain, but it grew. Slowly, hesitantly, the notes began to take shape. One of her grandmother's hymns, a song of endurance, of quiet faith, of surviving when the world wanted you gone. Helena didn't mean to sing. She didn't even realize she was doing it at first. But the music rose from her chest like a prayer, soft and aching, filling the silence of the chamber. The scrubbing slowed. The melody grew stronger. She sang the words now, her voice low and clear, each note carrying the weight of everything she had lost, everything she had survived. The hymn wrapped around her like a shield, a fragile barrier between herself and the thing in the shadows. And then she heard it. Movement. Helena froze, the brush still in her hand, the song dying on her lips. Her heart thundered in her ears as she strained to listen. Footsteps. No, not footsteps, something heavier. The soft pad of paws against stone, accompanied by the faint click of claws. It was coming closer. Helena's breath stopped. She didn't turn. She didn't dare. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the wet stone, and the brush still clutched in her trembling hand, and she waited. The creature stepped into the light. Helena saw it from the corner of her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness, massive and impossibly still. Slowly, against every screaming instinct, she turned her head, and she saw it fully for the first time. It was a beast, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, larger than any wolf she had ever imagined. Its shoulders were broad and powerful, its body thick with muscle beneath a coat of fur as black as midnight. Its legs were long and strong, ending in paws the size of dinner plates, each one tipped with claws that gleamed like polished steel. Its head was enormous, the muzzle long and lined with teeth that could crush bone. And its eyes, those glowing amber eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being seen for the first time in her life. It was not a wolf, not entirely. There was something else in its shape, something wrong, something that made her wolf recoil deep inside her chest. But it did not attack. It simply sat. The beast lowered itself onto its haunches, its tail curling around its body, and it watched her. Its breathing was slow and steady, each exhale a faint rumble in its chest, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Helena's hands shook, her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, but she did not look away. And then, impossibly, she realized something. It was listening. The beast tilted its head slightly, its ears flicking forward, and its gaze softened, just a fraction, just enough for Helena to see something beneath the wildness. She didn't know what made her do it. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was the faint, fragile hope that if she could give this creature what it wanted, it might let her live. Or perhaps it was simply instinct, the same instinct that had made her sing in the first place. Helena set the brush down carefully. She wiped her hands on her skirt, her fingers still trembling, and she began to sing again. The melody rose into the air, soft and steady, filling the vast chamber with sound. The hymn was one her grandmother had sung to her on the coldest nights, when the wind howled outside and the world felt too large and too cruel. It spoke of light in the darkness, of warmth in the cold, of the small, stubborn strength it took to keep going when everything else had fallen apart. Helena sang, and the beast listened. Its eyes did not leave her, but slowly, gradually, something in its posture changed. The tension in its shoulders eased, its breathing deepened, and when Helena dared to glance at it again, she saw that its eyes were half closed, the amber glow dimmed to a soft flicker. She kept singing. The minutes stretched on, and the hymn shifted into another, then another. Helena's voice grew stronger, steadier, the fear ebbing away as the music took hold. She didn't know how long she sang. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3. Time seemed to lose meaning in that chamber, in the presence of the beast. But when she finally reached the end of the last hymn, when the final note faded into silence, she realized something. The beast's eyes were closed. Its breathing had slowed, deep and even, and its massive body had relaxed entirely. It was still sitting, but its head had lowered slightly, resting against its chest, and its tail lay still against the stone floor. It was asleep. Helena stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't dare. She simply watched as the creature slept, its chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm, and she felt something strange and inexplicable unfurl in her chest. Not fear, not anymore. Something else. She didn't have a name for it. The sound of the clock striking midnight shattered the stillness like a stone through glass. The beast's eyes snapped open. Helena flinched, her heart leaping into her throat, but the beast didn't move toward her. It simply lifted its head, its gaze sharp and alert once more, and it stared at her for a long, breathless moment. Then it spoke. "Leave." The word was a growl, low and commanding, but there was something else beneath it, something that might have been exhaustion, or perhaps regret. "And tell no one what you've seen." Helena didn't need to be told twice. She rose to her feet, her legs shaking, and she backed toward the door. Her hand fumbled for the handle, and when she finally found it, she yanked it open and stumbled into the corridor beyond. The door slammed shut behind her, and Helena stood alone in the darkness, her chest heaving, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She should have been terrified. She should have collapsed right there, sobbing with relief at having survived. But she wasn't. Instead, as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to catch her breath, she realized something that made her pulse quicken for an entirely different reason. She was curious. What was that creature? Why did it want her to sing? And why, when it looked at her with those glowing amber eyes, did she feel as though it saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had? Helena didn't know, but she wanted to. Helena woke to the sound of bells. They rang through the palace like a summons from the heavens, deep and resonant, shaking the stone walls and rattling the narrow window of her cramped room. She sat up, her body aching from the night before, her mind still thick with exhaustion. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The chamber, the beast, the glowing amber eyes that had watched her sing. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the wild flutter of her heartbeat, and she tried to steady her breathing. She had survived. The realization should have brought relief, but instead it brought only confusion, because the beast had not hurt her. It had listened, and when it had finally fallen asleep, there had been something almost peaceful in the way its massive body had relaxed, something vulnerable in the way its eyes had closed. Helena didn't understand it, didn't know what to make of it, but she didn't have time to think about it now. The bells rang again, and from somewhere down the corridor, she heard Arya's voice cutting through the morning like a blade. "Move, all of you! The king is holding council. The grand hall needs to be spotless." Helena rose quickly, her legs protesting with every movement. She splashed cold water on her face from the basin in the corner, pulled on her gray servant's dress, and slipped the hymn book beneath her thin mattress. Then she hurried into the corridor. The other servants were already moving, their faces pale and drawn, their movements quick and efficient. Helena fell into step behind them, keeping her head down, her hands folded in front of her. No one spoke to her, no one even looked at her, but she could feel their eyes on her back, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. She survived. How? Let's see how long it lasts. Helena ignored them. She had survived worse than whispers. They reached the grand hall just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the high, narrow windows. The space was vast, its stone pillars rising like ancient trees toward the vaulted ceiling, and the long council table had already been set with goblets and parchment. Arya stood at the entrance, her arms crossed, her expression sharp. "You," she said, pointing at Helena, "the floors. Make sure there isn't a speck of dust anywhere." Helena nodded and moved to the far corner of the hall, where a bucket and brush had already been left for her. She knelt, dipped the brush into the cold water, and began to scrub. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and her hands ached with every stroke, but it gave her something to focus on, something to keep her mind from wandering back to the chamber and the creature that lived there. The bells rang one final time, and the hall fell silent. Then the doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the Alpha King entered. Helena didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her brush moving in steady, mechanical strokes. But even without looking, she could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the entire room had taken a breath and held it. King Damien strode into the hall with the kind of presence that demanded attention. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one echoing off the stone, and Helena could hear the faint rustle of his cloak as it swept behind him. She didn't need to see him to know what he looked like. She had glimpsed him before, from a distance, and the image had burned itself into her mind. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the pale, cold blue of winter ice. He was everything an alpha should be, commanding, sharp-eyed, beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, dangerous, unyielding. Helena scrubbed harder, her breath shallow. The king's beta entered next, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "You look different this morning, my lord." There was a pause. Helena risked a glance upward, just for a moment, and she saw the beta studying the king with a faint, curious smile. "Rested, perhaps?" the beta continued. The king did not answer. He simply took his seat at the head of the table, his movements smooth and precise, and gestured for the council to begin. But Helena had seen something in that brief glance, something that made her pulse quicken. The king's jaw was tight, his shoulders were tense, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes, as if he had not slept in days, or perhaps weeks. Except the beta had said he looked rested. Helena frowned, her hands stilling on the brush. She didn't understand. The king looked exhausted, worn thin, as if something had been eating away at him from the inside. And yet, the beta had said he looked different. The council members began to file in, their voices low and respectful as they took their seats around the table. Helena turned her attention back to the floor, scrubbing with renewed focus, determined to finish quickly and leave before anyone noticed her. But then she felt it. A gaze. It swept over her like a searchlight, slow and deliberate, and Helena's entire body went rigid. Her breath caught in her throat. Her wolf, silent and dormant for as long as she could remember, stirred deep inside her chest, a faint, uneasy tremor that made her heart race. She didn't look up. She didn't dare. But she knew. The king was looking at her. She could feel the weight of his attention pressing down on her, sharp and unyielding, as if he were trying to see through her skin and into her very soul. Her hands began to tremble. The brush slipped from her grip and clattered against the stone floor, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Helena's cheeks burned. She grabbed the brush quickly, her fingers clumsy, and forced herself to keep working, to keep her head down, to disappear. But the gaze didn't waver. It lingered for a moment longer, heavy and unreadable, and then, finally, it moved on. Helena exhaled shakily. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the brush, and her wolf was still stirring, restless and confused. She didn't understand. She had never felt this before, not once in her entire life. What was happening to her? She finished the floor as quickly as she could, her movements hurried and graceless, and then she rose to her feet. She gathered the bucket and brush, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground, and she hurried toward the door. As she stepped into the corridor, she nearly collided with Arya. The older woman stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She looked at Helena for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing, and then she stepped aside without a word. Helena fled. She didn't stop until she reached the servant quarters, her chest heaving, her heart pounding. The other girls were gathered in the main room, their voices low and furtive, but they fell silent the moment Helena entered. They stared at her. Not with pity, not with sympathy, but with something else, something that looked almost like awe. "She survived," one of them whispered. "A whole night," another added, her voice barely audible. "Let's see how long it lasts," a third said, her tone flat and cynical. Helena didn't respond. She simply walked past them, her head high, and retreated to her room. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Her hands were still shaking. She crossed to the narrow bed and pulled the hymn book from beneath the mattress. She sat down, her fingers tracing the worn cover, and she opened it to a page at random. The words blurred before her eyes, but she didn't need to see them. She knew them by heart. Helena began to hum. Softly at first, then louder, the melody filling the small room. It was one of her grandmother's hymns, a song of courage, of enduring when the world wanted you to break. She hummed, and then she sang, her voice low and steady, and the fear began to ebb away. But even as the music soothed her, even as her breathing slowed and her hands stopped trembling, she couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in her chest. The pull. It was faint, barely there, but it was undeniable. A tug, deep and insistent, drawing her thoughts back to the chamber, to the beast, to the way it had listened to her sing, the way its eyes had softened, the way it had fallen asleep as if her voice were the only thing in the world that mattered. The beast had not hurt her. It had listened. And something about that terrified her more than claws ever could. Because she wanted to go back. She wanted to see it again, to hear its voice, to understand what it was, why it was there, why it had let her live when so many others had not. Helena closed the hymn book and pressed it to her chest, her eyes closing. She didn't understand what was happening to her, didn't know why her wolf had stirred for the first time in her life when the king's gaze had swept over her, didn't know why she felt this strange, inexplicable pull toward the creature in the chamber. But she knew one thing. Tonight, she would return. The day passed slowly. Helena moved through her tasks in a fog, her mind elsewhere. She scrubbed floors, hauled water, emptied chamber pots, and sang quietly to herself whenever she thought no one was listening. The other servants gave her a wide berth, their whispers following her like shadows, but she didn't care. She was already somewhere else. As the sun began to set, as the shadows grew long and the air turned cold, Helena returned to her room. She washed her face, braided her hair, and tucked the hymn book into the folds of her skirt. Then she stood by the narrow window and watched as the last light faded from the sky. When the darkness was complete, when the palace had fallen into its evening stillness, Helena left her room. She walked through the corridors, her footsteps soft and careful, and she descended the winding staircase that led to the lower levels. The air grew colder with every step, the torches fewer and farther between, and the silence pressed in around her like a living thing. Finally, she reached the corridor. The massive iron door loomed at the end, black and imposing, and Helena stopped before it. Her hand hovered over the handle, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. And then she realized something. She wasn't afraid. Not of the beast, not of what might happen to her inside that chamber. She was afraid of what it made her feel. The pull, the curiosity, the strange, inexplicable sense that the creature on the other side of that door was somehow important, that it saw her in a way no one else ever had. Helena took a deep breath. She placed her hand on the handle, and she pushed the door open. The second night was easier than the first, not because the fear had vanished, it hadn't, but because Helena knew what to expect now. The vast chamber with its flickering candles and rich tapestries, the massive bed draped in furs, the scent of earth and wildness that clung to the air like a living thing, and the beast, watching from the shadows with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. When Helena entered, the door closing behind her with that same tomb-like finality, she didn't freeze, she didn't tremble. She simply crossed to the bucket and brush, knelt on the cold stone floor, and began to work. And as she worked, she sang. The beast emerged from the shadows almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for her. It padded across the floor on silent paws, its massive body moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and it settled onto its haunches near the bed. It watched her, its amber eyes unblinking, and it listened. Helena scrubbed the floor, her voice rising and falling in the melody of her grandmother's hymns, and the tension in the chamber began to ease. The beast's breathing slowed, its posture relaxed, and when Helena finally set the brush aside and looked up, she found the creature's gaze softer than it had been the night before, almost peaceful. The ritual continued. Night after night, Helena returned to the chamber. She cleaned the floors, washed the linens, polished the dark wood furniture until it gleamed, and always she sang. The beast never stopped her, never commanded her to be silent. It simply listened, its massive head resting on its paws, its eyes half closed, as if her voice were the only thing keeping it tethered to something resembling calm. And slowly, impossibly, things began to change. On the third night, as Helena finished scrubbing the floor and rose to her feet, the beast spoke. "Come here." Helena froze, her hands still damp from the water. The beast's voice was low, rough, but there was no anger in it, no threat, only something else, something she couldn't name. She crossed the chamber slowly, her heart pounding, and stopped a few paces from where the beast sat. It watched her, its amber eyes steady, and then it lowered its head. "My fur. It tangles. Brush it." Helena blinked. She glanced around the room and spotted a large, silver-handled brush resting on a table near the bed. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, and then she approached the beast. Up close, it was even more imposing. Its shoulders were level with her chest, its body radiating heat and a wild, untamed energy that made her wolf stir uneasily. But the beast didn't move. It simply sat, waiting. Helena reached out, her hand hovering just above the creature's fur, and then she touched it. It was thick, coarse, but warm. She began to brush. The beast let out a low rumble, not a growl, but something deeper, something that might have been contentment. Helena's breath caught, but she didn't stop. She drew the brush through the creature's fur in long, careful strokes, working through the tangles, smoothing the rough patches. The beast's eyes closed, and its breathing deepened. Helena didn't know how long she stood there, brushing the creature's fur, her hands moving in a steady rhythm. But when she finally stepped back, the beast opened its eyes and looked at her. "Thank you," it said. The words were simple, quiet, but they hit Helena like a blow to the chest. No one had ever thanked her before. On the 5th night, the beast asked her to trim its claws. Helena had seen the claws before, long, curved, gleaming like polished steel. They were weapons, sharp enough to rend flesh and bone, and the thought of touching them made her stomach twist with unease. But the beast's voice was calm, steady, and so she obeyed. She knelt before the creature, a small file in her hand, and she took one massive paw in her lap. The claws were cold beneath her fingers, hard and unyielding, but she worked carefully, filing down the sharp edges until they were smooth. The beast watched her the entire time, its gaze fixed on her face, and it did not move. When she finished, it flexed its paw, testing the work, and then it looked at her again. "You are careful, gentle. Most would fear to touch me." Helena set the file aside and met the beast's gaze. "I do fear you," she said quietly, "but you have not hurt me, so I will not hurt you." The beast's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise, or perhaps respect. "You are different," it said. Helena didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. On the 7th night, they began to speak. Helena had just finished cleaning the chamber and was perched on the edge of the massive bed, her hymn book open in her lap. She had been singing softly, her voice filling the quiet space, when the beast suddenly interrupted. "Who are you?" Helena's voice faltered. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat, and found the beast watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. I She swallowed hard. "My name is Helena." "I know your name," the beast said. Its voice was low, steady, but there was a weight to the words. "I mean, who are you? Why are you here?" Helena's fingers tightened on the hymn book. She thought about lying, about giving some half-truth that would satisfy the creature without revealing too much. But when she looked into those amber eyes, she found she couldn't. "I was given away by my parents, in exchange for a debt they couldn't pay." The beast tilted its head slightly. "Given away," it repeated, "like livestock." Helena flinched at the word, but she nodded. "Yes." "Why would they do that?" Helena's throat tightened. She looked down at the hymn book, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "Because I am worthless to them," she said. "I am 22, and I have never shifted. I have no mate. In their eyes, in the eyes of my pack, I am nothing." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were true. She had lived her entire life knowing she was unwanted, knowing she was a burden, knowing that the moment her family found a way to be rid of her, they would take it. The beast was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke again, and its voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You are not worthless." Helena's breath caught. She looked up, her eyes wide, and found the beast watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your songs," it continued, "they carry life. They carry something I cannot name, but it is not worthless. It is the opposite." Helena stared at the creature, her heart pounding, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, something fragile and aching, something she had buried so deep she thought it was gone forever. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. "No one has ever said that to me before," she whispered. The beast's gaze softened. "Then they are fools." Helena didn't know what to say, so she simply sat there, clutching her hymn book, and let the words settle into her like a balm. After a long silence, she found her voice again. "Can I ask you something?" The beast inclined its head. "Why do they fear this place?" Helena asked. "The other servants. They whisper about the king's guest chamber. They say girls go in and never come out, or they come out, changed, scarred. What happens to them?" The beast was silent for so long that Helena thought it wouldn't answer. But then it rose to its feet, its massive body unfolding with a slow, deliberate grace, and it turned toward the far wall. "Come," it said. Helena hesitated, then rose and followed. The beast led her to the far corner of the chamber, where the tapestries hung thick and heavy. It reached out with one enormous paw and pushed aside the fabric, revealing a hidden door set into the stone. The door was small, barely large enough for a person to pass through, and it looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. The beast pushed the door open, and a gust of cold air rushed into the chamber, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Beyond the door was a tunnel. Helena peered into the darkness, her heart pounding, and she saw the faint outline of a passage carved into the rock. It sloped downward, disappearing into shadow, and she could hear the distant sound of wind moving through trees. "This tunnel leads outside the palace," the beast said, "into the forest beyond. Anyone who treats me as a monster, who strikes at me, who curses me, who looks at me with hatred, I cast them out here. They are free to go, but they never return to the palace. They never return to spread what they have seen." Helena's breath caught. You let them go?" "I do not kill them," the beast said. Its voice was steady, but there was something heavy in it, something that might have been regret. "I am not a murderer, but I will not be caged by their fear. So I give them a choice: leave and never speak of this, or stay and serve without cruelty." Helena stared at the tunnel, her mind racing. "But the others, the servants who came out scarred—" "They fought," the beast said simply. "They tried to kill me. I defended myself, and then I let them go." Helena turned to look at the creature, her eyes wide. "But I didn't fight you. I didn't try to hurt you." The beast's gaze softened. "No," it said, "you did not. You sang to me. You brushed my fur. You trimmed my claws. You treated me with kindness. You made me feel—" It paused, as if searching for the right word. "Human." Helena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process what she was hearing. The beast stepped closer, and Helena had to tilt her head back to meet its gaze. Its amber eyes glowed in the dim light, and there was something raw in them, something vulnerable. "I want you to be mine," the beast said, its voice low and steady. "I want to mark you, make you my mate." Helena's breath stopped. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible, and Helena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry, her heart racing. "I don't understand. You barely know me." "I know enough," the beast said. "I know that you are kind, that you see me, not as a monster, but as something more. And I know that your voice is the only thing that has brought me peace in longer than I can remember." Helena stared at the creature, her mind spinning. She thought of her life before this, the cold indifference of her family, the sneers of her pack, the endless, grinding loneliness of being unwanted. And then she thought of the beast, of the way it listened to her sing, of the way it had thanked her, of the way it had called her songs life. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to answer. Because part of her, a part she didn't understand, a part that terrified her, wanted to say yes. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive by keeping her head down and her heart locked away, whispered that this was madness, that she couldn't possibly tie herself to a creature she didn't understand, that she needed time to think, time to process. Helena took a shaky breath. Her voice wavered, and she forced herself to meet the beast's gaze. "I need to think about it." The beast's eyes flickered with something that might have been disappointment, but it nodded slowly. "Then think," it said. "But know this, Helena. I have waited a long time to feel what you make me feel, and I will not wait forever." Helena's heart twisted in her chest. She nodded, unable to speak, and the beast turned away. "It is past midnight," it said quietly. "Leave, and tell no one what you have seen." Helena fled. She stumbled through the tunnel, out into the corridor, and up the winding stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind was spinning, her heart pounding, and she didn't stop until she reached her small, cramped room. She collapsed onto the thin straw mat, her hands pressed to her chest, and she stared at the ceiling. The beast wanted her, wanted to make her its mate. And the worst part, the most terrifying, incomprehensible part, was that she wasn't sure she wanted to say no. Helena's eyes burned from lack of sleep, her body trembling as she sat on the edge of her little mattress in the pre-dawn darkness. The other servant girls slept soundly around her, their breathing soft and even, but Helena's mind offered no such mercy. The beast's words circled through her thoughts like wolves on a hunt, relentless and consuming. I want you to be mine. I want to mark you, make you my mate. She pressed her palms against her face, trying to steady herself, but her heart hammered against her ribs with a wild, terrifying rhythm. No one had ever wanted her. Not her parents, who sold her like spoiled grain. Not her pack, who whispered worthless whenever she passed. Not even the other servants here, who looked at her as though she were already a ghost. But the beast wanted her. The beast who listened to her songs as though they were prayers, who sat still while she brushed his fur with gentle hands, who spoke to her not with pity, but with something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. Helena's fingers found the worn hymn book on the floor beside her, the only thing she owned that carried love in its pages. She traced the cracked leather cover, remembering the old woman's weathered hands, her croaking voice singing the same hymns Helena now sang to a monster in the dark. "You have made me feel human," the beast had said. Helena's chest tightened. She had made something feel human. Her, the girl who couldn't even shift into a wolf. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the narrow window, Helena had made her decision. Her hands had stopped shaking, her breathing had steadied into something resolute, something that felt almost like courage. Better to belong to a beast who treated her with kindness than to remain a servant forever, scrubbing floors until her knees gave out and her voice grew too hoarse to sing. Better to be wanted, even by a monster, than to be invisible for the rest of her life. She rose silently, careful not to wake the other girls, and slipped out of the cramped room. The palace corridors were still dim, the torches burning low in their sconces, casting long shadows across the cold stone floors. Her bare feet made no sound as she moved through the hallways, her heart beating faster with each step. She didn't wait for nightfall. She didn't wait for Arya's summons or the beta's escort. She wanted to surprise him, to tell him yes before fear had the chance to claw its way back into her chest and change her mind. Helena's breath came quicker as she approached the massive iron door of the king's guest chamber. Her hand trembled only slightly as she reached for the handle. She didn't knock. She simply pushed it open and stepped inside. And froze. The chamber was bathed in the pale light of early morning, and on the bed, the enormous bed draped in furs and silk, the beast writhed and twisted in agony, his massive body convulsing, bones snapping with sickening cracks that echoed through the room like breaking branches. Fur receded in waves, pulling back into skin that gleamed with sweat. Muscles reformed, shifting and reshaping with wet, tearing sounds that made Helena's stomach lurch. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only stand there, transfixed and horrified, as the creature she had come to accept became something else entirely. A man. Not just any man. The transformation slowed, the final shudders racking through his body as his form solidified into something painfully, impossibly familiar. Broad shoulders, a strong jaw, dark hair falling across a face she had seen every day in the palace halls, commanding and cold and untouchable. Alpha King Damien. Helena's knees nearly buckled. Her mind struggled to piece together what her eyes were showing her. The beast, her beast, the one who listened to her songs and called her worthy, was the king. Had always been the king. Damien's eyes snapped open, amber glowing, fading to their natural dark brown eyes, and his gaze locked onto her. For a single, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Then his expression twisted into something dark and furious, something that made Helena take an instinctive step backward. "What are you doing here?" The voice that roared from his throat was not entirely his own. It carried the beast's growl beneath it, rough and wild and barely restrained. Damien, or the beast wearing Damien's face, rose from the bed, his body still trembling from the transformation, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Helena's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her thoughts scattered like frightened birds. I came to, she stammered, her voice small and broken. You asked me. Last night, you asked me to be yours, and I... You came to accept now? The words were venom, spat with a rage so visceral, it seemed to fill the entire room. Now that you know what I am? Now that you've seen the crown on my head? No! Helena's voice cracked. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. Liar! The beast's snarl ripped through Damien's lips, his body shaking with barely controlled fury. But it wasn't just anger that twisted his features. It was something raw, something that looked almost like pain. You only say this now because you know I am the king. It was never real. You would never have chosen the monster. Helena's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. That's not true. I came here before I knew. I came to tell you yes because you were kind to me, because you made me feel enough. The word cracked like a whip, and Helena flinched. Damien turned away from her, his shoulders heaving, his hands gripping the edge of the bedframe hard enough that the wood groaned under the pressure. When he spoke again, his voice was colder, more controlled, but still edged with the beast's growl. Darius! Damien's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, echoing through the chamber. Darius, come here now! Within moments, the iron door swung open and the beta strode inside. Darius was a towering man, broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, with eyes that missed nothing. He took in the scene quickly, the king standing rigid and trembling, the servant girl pale and tear-streaked, and his expression tightened. Take her to the mountains, Damien said, his voice flat and emotionless now, the beast's influence fading, but its damage already done. She is no longer welcome here. Helena's breath left her in a broken gasp. No, please! Do it, Damien snapped, refusing to look at her. Darius hesitated, his gaze flicked between the king and the trembling girl, and something in his weathered face softened. He had served Damien for years, long enough to recognize when the king's orders were born of reason, and when they were born of the beast's desperate need to protect itself the only way it knew how, by pushing away what it couldn't bear to lose. As you command, my king, Darius said quietly, his tone carefully neutral. Helena's legs nearly gave out as Darius's hand closed gently around her arm. She looked back at Damien one last time, hoping, praying that he would turn around, that he would see the truth written across her face. But he didn't. He stood with his back to her, rigid and unyielding, as Darius led her from the chamber. The iron door slammed shut behind them with the sound like a coffin closing. Darius didn't speak as he guided Helena through the palace corridors. His grip on her arm was firm, but not cruel, his pace steady. Servants scattered out of their way, eyes wide and curious, whispers already spreading like wildfire. The girl who survived the guest chamber was being cast out. Helena's mind felt numb, her body moving on instinct alone. She clutched her hymn book to her chest, the only thing she had managed to grab before Darius pulled her away. Her grandmother's hymns. The only love she had ever known. They passed through the palace gates, through the outer courtyards, and into the forested hills beyond. The morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the trees, but Helena barely noticed. Her thoughts were still trapped in that chamber, replaying the look of fury and betrayal on Damien's face. He thought she had lied. He thought she only wanted him for his crown. After what felt like hours, Darius finally stopped. They stood at the edge of a clearing. A small, weathered cabin nestled between the trees. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, and the scent of firewood and earth hung in the air. Helena blinked, confused. What? You'll stay here, Darius said quietly, releasing her arm. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a gentleness she hadn't expected. There's food inside. Water. Enough to last you a few weeks if you're careful. Helena stared at him, her mind struggling to understand. But he said to cast me into the forest, to let the wilds decide. Darius's jaw tightened. The beast said that, not the king, and I know the difference. He stepped back, his gaze steady and firm. Stay hidden. Don't come back to the palace. If anyone asks, I followed his orders to the letter. Helena's throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears she could no longer hold back. Why are you doing this? Darius was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then he turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. He doesn't want you dead, girl. He just can't bear the thought of you breaking him further." And with that, the beta disappeared into the trees, leaving Helena alone. She stood there for a long time, staring at the cabin, her arms wrapped tightly around her hymn book. The forest was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. No howls, no footsteps, just silence. Slowly, Helena walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. Inside, the space was small but clean. A single bed, a table, a fireplace already crackling with warmth. Supplies lined the shelves: dried meat, bread, water skins. She sank onto the bed, her body finally giving out, and let the tears come. "Free," Darius had said, but she didn't feel free. She felt shattered. Miles away in the palace, the sun climbed higher into the sky. The transformation had fully completed, the beast retreating back into the depths of Damien's mind as his human form solidified. He stood in the center of his chamber, staring at the iron door, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. And then, like a dam breaking, awareness crashed over him. What had he done? Horror flooded through him, cold and suffocating. He had sent her away. He had looked into her tear-streaked face and called her a liar. He had let the beast, terrified and wounded and desperate, make the choice for him. Damien's legs buckled and he sank onto the edge of the bed, his head falling into his hands. The room felt impossibly empty without her. The silence pressed against his ears like a weight. No songs, no soft footsteps, no gentle hands brushing his fur. Just emptiness. That night, when the moon rose and the curse took hold once more, the beast woke alone. It paced the chamber, snarling and restless, searching for the voice that had soothed it, the presence that had made the darkness bearable. But Helena was gone, and without her songs, the beast could not sleep. Damien did not sleep. Night after night, the curse deepened. The beast grew stronger, hungrier, clawing deeper into his soul with every passing hour. His mind frayed at the edges, exhaustion pulling him under like quicksand. He sent guards to find her. They returned empty-handed. He searched the forest himself when dawn broke, calling her name until his voice was hoarse. But Helena had vanished. And slowly, inevitably, Damien began to unravel. 3 weeks had passed since Darius left Helena at the cabin, and the forest had become both her prison and her sanctuary. She woke each morning to bird song and the smell of pine, gathering water from the nearby stream and rationing the supplies the beta had left her. The cabin was small, but sturdy, and the solitude should have been peaceful. But peace was a stranger to Helena now. Every night, she lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the wooden beams above her, her mind replaying the moment Damien's face had twisted with fury and betrayal. "You only say this now because you know I am the king." The words haunted her, like a curse of their own. By the second week, her supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing. Helena knew she couldn't hide forever. The forest was vast, but it wasn't empty. She had heard the howls of wolves in the distance, seen the smoke from campfires rising through the trees. There were packs out here, living beyond the palace's reach. She had 2 choices: starve in isolation or risk stepping into their world. Helena chose survival. The pack she found was small, rougher than the one she'd been born into. They lived in a cluster of makeshift shelters near a wide, rushing river, their lives shaped by hunting and trade rather than titles and bloodlines. When Helena approached their camp, clutching her hymn book and wearing the same ragged servant's dress she'd been cast out in, the wolves eyed her with suspicion. "I can work," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I can clean, cook, mend clothes, and I can sing." The pack leader, a grizzled man named Roderick, with a scar cutting across his jaw, had looked her up and down, then shrugged. "We don't need another mouth to feed, girl, but if you can earn your keep, you can stay. Step out of line, and you're gone." Helena nodded. She didn't expect kindness. She only needed a chance. So she worked. She scrubbed pots by the river until her fingers were raw, helped the women prepare meals over open fires, and mended torn tunics and hunting leathers by candlelight. In the evenings, when the pack gathered around the fire, she sang. Old hymns her grandmother had taught her, songs that spoke of loss and hope and endurance. The wolves didn't thank her, but they listened, and slowly, begrudgingly, they let her stay. Helena told herself this was better. She was free here. No one sneered at her for being wolfless. No one called her worthless. She was simply another outsider trying to survive, and that was enough. But at night, when the moon climbed high and the pack's howls echoed through the trees, Helena lay awake and thought of him. She thought of glowing amber eyes watching her from the shadows, of a deep, rumbling voice that had called her songs beautiful, of massive paws that had stilled beneath her gentle hands. She thought of the beast who had made her feel worthy, and she hated herself for it. Far from the forest, within the cold stone walls of the palace, King Damien was unraveling. The council chamber was stifling despite the chill in the air, the long table crowded with advisors and pack leaders who spoke in low, urgent tones. Damien sat at the head of the table, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. He hadn't slept in 3 weeks. Every night, the curse returned with a vengeance. The transformation tore through him like wildfire, bones breaking and reforming, his human mind submerged beneath the beast's relentless, burning consciousness. And without Helena's voice to soothe it, the beast could not rest. It paced the chamber, snarling and clawing at the walls, searching for something it could not find. It howled until Damien's throat was raw, thrashed until the furniture lay in splinters. And when dawn finally came and the transformation reversed, Damien was left trembling and hollow, his body aching and his mind frayed at the edges. He had sent guards to search for her. They combed the forests, questioned travelers, searched every village within a day's ride of the palace. But Helena had vanished, as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Darius had reported that he'd followed orders, cast her into the wilderness as commanded. The beta's expression had been carefully neutral, his tone steady, but Damien had seen the flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or pity. Damien hadn't pressed him. He didn't want to know the truth, didn't want to face the possibility that Helena was dead because of him. Your Majesty. The voice cut through Damien's thoughts like a blade, and he looked up to see Killian standing at the far end of the table. The head of the pack's guard was a towering man, broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, with sharp eyes that seemed to calculate every word before it left his mouth. His presence commanded attention, and when he spoke, the other council members fell silent. "We cannot delay this decision any longer," Killian said, his tone respectful but firm. "The full moon mating ceremony is in 2 weeks. Tradition demands that you take a mate, and the pack is watching. They need stability. They need to see their king united with a strong Luna." Damien's jaw tightened. "I am aware of tradition, Killian." "Then you understand that your condition cannot continue." Killian's gaze didn't waver. "You have not slept in weeks. Your temper has grown unpredictable. The servants are terrified to enter your chambers, and your decisions," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "have been erratic." Damien's fingers dug into the armrests. He wanted to snarl, to lash out, to silence Killian's smug, calculated tone. But he couldn't, because Killian was right. Without Helena, the beast was consuming him. "I have a solution," Killian continued, his voice smooth now, almost soothing. "My daughter, Milda. She is strong, intelligent, and well-respected among the pack. A union between your bloodline and mine would strengthen our military power, secure alliances with the border territories, and provide the stability your throne desperately needs." Damien's gaze flicked to the other council members. They were nodding, murmuring their agreement. One of the older advisors, a wiry man named Corwin, cleared his throat. "Killian speaks wisely, Your Majesty. The pack needs to see strength. A queen at your side would quiet the whispers and restore confidence in your rule." Another voice chimed in. "And Milda is, an excellent choice. Beautiful, capable, and loyal." Damien closed his eyes, exhaustion pressing down on him like a physical weight. He didn't want this. Didn't want Milda with her practiced smiles and calculating gaze. Didn't want a political alliance masquerading as a mate bond. He wanted a girl with a voice like starlight, who had brushed his fur with trembling hands and sung hymns to keep the darkness at bay. But she was gone, and his throne was crumbling. "Fine," Damien said, his voice hollow. "Arrange the ceremony." Killian's expression didn't change, but satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. You have made the right choice, Your Majesty. I will inform Milda immediately. She will be honored. The council meeting ended shortly after, the advisors filing out of the chamber with murmured congratulations and false smiles. Damien remained seated, staring at the empty table, his chest tight and his mind screaming. He had just agreed to mate with a woman he didn't love, and every fiber of his being knew it was a mistake. That night, the beast raged harder than ever before. It tore through the chamber like a storm, shattering mirrors and overturning furniture, its howls echoing through the palace halls. The servants barricaded themselves in their quarters, and even Darius stood outside the iron door with his hand on his sword, his expression grim. Inside, Damien fought for control, but the beast was stronger now. Fueled by exhaustion and despair, it clawed at his mind, demanding the one thing it couldn't have. Her. In the forest, Helena sat by the river, her bare feet dangling in the cold water. The pack had settled in for the night, their campfires glowing like small stars in the darkness. She should have been tired. She had spent the entire day hauling water and scrubbing pots, but sleep felt impossible. One of the younger wolves, a girl named Ivy, with braided hair and curious eyes, had approached her earlier that evening when Helena was mending a torn cloak by the fire. "Have you heard the news?" Ivy had asked, her voice low and excited. Helena looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "What news?" "The Alpha King is taking a mate." Ivy's eyes sparkled with gossip. "They say it's Killian's daughter, Milda. The ceremony is in 2 weeks, under the full moon. Everyone's talking about it." Helena's chest had tightened, her fingers gripping the needle hard enough to draw blood. She forced her expression to remain neutral. "That's good for him." Ivy had leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say he's been cursed, that something's wrong with him, but maybe a mate will fix it." Helena had nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak, and Ivy had eventually wandered off to share the news with someone else. Now, sitting by the river, with the moon's reflections shimmering on the water, Helena tried to convince herself that she didn't care. He had cast her out. He had called her a liar. He had looked at her with such fury and betrayal that it still made her chest ache to remember it. She should be glad he was moving on, glad he would have a queen who could stand beside him without shame, who could shift and howl and be everything Helena could never be. But the thought of him standing beneath the full moon, claiming another woman as his mate, made something inside her fracture. Helena pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, and stared at the water. She told herself she was better off here, that she had found a kind of freedom in this rough, simple life, that she didn't need the palace or the king or the beast who had made her feel, for one brief, impossible moment, like she mattered. But at night, when the moon was high and the world was quiet, she couldn't stop thinking about glowing amber eyes and a voice that rumbled through the darkness. "You are not worthless. Your songs carry life." Helena closed her eyes, her breath hitching. 2 weeks later, the news rippled through the forest like wildfire. The Alpha King's mating ceremony was tonight, and travelers from every corner of the territory were making their way to the palace to witness it. Helena told herself she wouldn't go, that it was madness to even consider it. But as the sun began to set, and the pack prepared their evening meal, she found herself slipping away from the camp, her hymn book tucked into the worn satchel Ivy had given her. She moved through the trees like a ghost, her feet carrying her toward the palace without conscious thought. She told herself she only wanted to see him one last time, to know that he was happy, that the curse had been broken, that he had found peace with someone else. She was lying. She didn't want to see him happy with Milda. She wanted him to look at her the way the beast once had, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. But Helena didn't stop walking. The moon rose higher, full and silver, and the distant sound of drums echoed through the trees. The ceremony had begun. The forest thinned as Helena drew closer to the palace, and the sound of drums grew louder, deep, rhythmic, primal. They pounded through the night air like a heartbeat, calling wolves from every corner of the territory to witness the Alpha King's union. Helena's hands trembled as she gripped the strap of her satchel, her hymn book pressing against her side like a talisman. She had told herself 100 times to turn back, to return to the camp by the river and pretend this night didn't exist. But her feet had carried her forward anyway, drawn by something she couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. The palace grounds were ablaze with torchlight. Hundreds of wolves had gathered in the massive clearing before the ceremonial platform, a raised stone dais draped in furs and woven with flowers that gleamed silver under the full moon's light. The crowd was a sea of faces, some familiar from her brief time as a servant, others strangers who had traveled from distant packs to witness their king claim his queen. Helena's hands trembled as she gripped the strap of her satchel, her hymn book pressing against her side like a talisman. She had told herself 100 times to turn back, to return to the camp by the river and pretend this night didn't exist. But her feet had carried her forward anyway, drawn by something she couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. The palace grounds were ablaze with torchlight. Hundreds of wolves had gathered in the massive clearing before the ceremonial platform, a raised stone dais draped in furs and woven with flowers that gleamed silver under the full moon's light. The crowd was a sea of faces, some familiar from her brief time as a servant, others strangers who had traveled from distant packs to witness their king claim his queen. Helena's chest tightened as her gaze found the platform. And there he was. Damien sat on a throne-like chair carved from dark wood, his posture rigid and regal. He wore ceremonial robes of deep crimson and black, his dark hair swept back from his face, his expression as cold and unyielding as stone. He looked every inch the Alpha King, powerful, untouchable, distant. But Helena had learned to see past the mask. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests too tightly, the hollowness in his eyes. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to fall. Beside him sat Milda. Helena's breath caught in her throat. Milda was everything a queen should be. Beautiful, with a long auburn hair that cascaded over her shoulders in perfect waves, her gown a shimmering gold that caught the torchlight and made her look like something out of a legend. Her smile was radiant, her posture poised and confident. She looked at Damien with open adoration, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though she already belonged there. Helena's chest twisted painfully. This was what Aluna looked like. Not a wolfless servant in rags, but a woman who could stand beside the king without shame. A woman who could shift, who could lead, who could give him heirs and alliances, and everything Helena could never provide. Near the platform, Killian stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression smug and satisfied. The head of the pack's guard looked like a man who had just won a war. His daughter was about to become queen, and with her ascension, his influence over the throne would become absolute. He had maneuvered carefully, patiently, and now his victory was moments away. The drums reached a crescendo, then fell silent. An elder wolf stepped onto the platform, his robes white and embroidered with silver thread, his voice carrying across the clearing like a bell. We gather under the light of the full moon to witness the union of our Alpha King, Damien, with Milda, daughter of Killian, head of our guard. Let the bond be spoken. Let the claim be made. Let the moon bear witness. The crowd erupted in howls, a chorus of voices rising into the night, wild and jubilant. Helena's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She should leave. She should turn around and disappear back into the forest before this broke her completely. But she couldn't move. The elder turned to Damien. Do you, Damien, Alpha King of this pack, claim this woman as your mate? Do you vow to protect her, honor her, and bind your soul to hers under the light of the moon? Damien's jaw tightened. For a long, terrible moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and the crowd began to shift uneasily. Then, in a voice that was low and hollow, Damien spoke. I do. The words felt like a blade sliding between Helena's ribs. The elder turned to Milda. And do you, Milda, daughter of Killian, accept this bond? Do you vow to stand beside your king, to honor him, and to unite your soul with his under the light of the moon? Milda's smile widened, her voice clear and bright. I do. The crowd howled again, louder this time, and the elder raised his hands. Then let the bond be sealed. Let the mark be given. Let the moon... A shout cut through the ceremony like a crack of lightning. Intruder! Spy! Helena's blood turned to ice. A guard emerged from the trees behind her, his hand clamped around her arm before she could react. She stumbled forward, her satchel falling to the ground as he dragged her into the clearing. The hymn book tumbled free, its pages fluttering in the dirt. "I found her hiding in the forest, watching the ceremony like a thief," the guard shouted, his grip bruising as he hauled Helena toward the platform. The crowd's howls died instantly, replaced by shocked murmurs and gasps. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her, and Helena's legs nearly buckled under the weight of their stares. The ceremony ground to a halt. Damien's head snapped toward her, and for a single, suspended moment, their eyes met. Helena saw everything in that gaze. Shock, disbelief, and something raw and desperate that made her chest ache. His entire body went rigid, his hands releasing the armrests as though he was about to rise. "Let her go," Damien said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't a request. It was a command, sharp and absolute. But before the guard could react, another voice rang out, deeper, colder, and filled with barely restrained fury. "Seize her." Killian stepped forward, his face twisted with rage, his eyes locked onto Helena with the intensity of a predator who had just spotted prey. "She is an intruder who threatens the sanctity of this ceremony, a spy sent to disrupt the king's union." "She is no spy," Damien snapped, rising from his chair. "Release her, now." But Killian's voice boomed louder, drowning out the king's command. "Guards, restrain her." Two more guards rushed forward, their loyalty to Killian outweighing their hesitation. They grabbed Helena's arms, wrenching them behind her back with brutal efficiency. She cried out as they forced her to knees, her bones striking the cold stone with a sharp, sickening crack. Pain exploded through her legs. Her wrists pinned so tightly she felt the skin break. She gasped, her vision blurring, and the sound that tore from her throat was raw and terrified. A scream. Sharp, pained, desperate. And that scream shattered the last thread of Damien's control. The full moon hung heavy and silver above them, its light flooding the clearing like liquid metal. The potion Damien had taken, weak, unreliable, meant to keep the beast at bay, failed in an instant. The transformation didn't emerge, it erupted. Damien's body convulsed, his robes tearing as fur burst from his skin in violent waves. Bones cracked and reformed with sounds like snapping tree branches, his frame expanding, muscles twisting and reshaping into something far larger, far more monstrous than any wolf had a right to be. His human face contorted, elongating into a muzzle filled with teeth like daggers, and his eyes, those dark, weary eyes, blazed with amber fire. The crowd screamed. Wolves scattered in every direction, stumbling over one another in their desperation to flee. Milda shrieked, her golden gown tangling around her legs as she bolted from the platform. The elder collapsed backward, his white robes pooling around him as he scrambled away. But the beast didn't see them. It saw only her. The creature that had been Damien roared, a sound so deep and primal it seemed to shake the earth itself. And then it moved. The guards holding Helena barely had time to register what was happening before the beast was upon them. Massive claws struck the first guard with enough force to send him flying, his body crashing into the ceremonial platform with a sickening crunch. The second guard released Helena and tried to run, but the beast caught him by the shoulder and hurled him aside like a broken doll. Helena collapsed forward, gasping for breath, her wrists screaming in pain. She looked up, and the beast loomed over her, enormous, terrifying, its breath hot and ragged. But it didn't attack. It stood between her and the crowd, its body trembling with barely restrained violence, its glowing eyes scanning the clearing for any threat. And when it spoke, the voice that rumbled from its throat was not entirely Damien's, not entirely the beast's, but something caught between the two, raw and possessive and absolute. "This is my mate." The words rolled across the clearing like thunder. The crowd froze. Even the wolves who had been fleeing stopped in their tracks, their faces pale with shock and fear. The beast turned slowly, its gaze sweeping over the gathered pack, and when it spoke again, the command was unmistakable. "This is your Luna. Anyone who opposes her opposes me." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Helena's breath came in shallow, broken gasps as she stared up at the creature towering over her. This was the beast she had sung to, the one who had listened to her hymns and slept for the first time in years. And now it stood before the entire pack, claiming her as his own. Not because of a fated bond, not because of duty or tradition, but because she was his. Killian's face twisted with rage and humiliation. His daughter, his carefully positioned, perfectly poised daughter, had been cast aside for a wolfless servant. His plans, his alliances, his future, all of it lay in ruins at the feet of a girl who couldn't even shift. His hand moved to the hilt of the blade at his side, his fingers curling around the leather grip, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fury that promised violence. But he didn't draw the weapon. Not yet. The beast's glowing gaze locked onto him, and Killian saw something in those amber eyes that made even a seasoned warrior hesitate. A promise. Touch her, and I will end you. Slowly, Killian's hand released the blade. He stepped back, his expression cold and unreadable, but the rage simmering beneath his surface was palpable. The beast turned back to Helena, its massive form lowering slightly, its breath slowing, and in the creature's glowing eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Relief. Not triumph, not possession. Relief that she was alive. That she was here. Helena's chest tightened, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time since she'd been dragged into the clearing, she felt the weight of what had just happened. The Alpha King had claimed her before the entire pack. There was no going back now. The clearing was frozen in silence. The only sound, the beast's ragged breathing, and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Hundreds of wolves stood motionless, their faces pale with shock and fear, their eyes locked on the massive creature that towered over the trembling servant girl. Helena remained on her knees, her wrists aching, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The stone beneath her was cold and unforgiving, but she barely felt it. All she could see were those glowing amber eyes staring down at her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. The beast's massive form shifted slightly, its head lowering until it was level with hers. The crowd watched, transfixed, as the creature that had just declared her his mate waited, silent, expectant. And then it spoke. The voice was rough, layered with growls and something achingly human beneath. Will you be mine? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Helena's throat closed, tears streaming down her face. This was the same question the beast had asked her weeks ago in the darkness of the guest chamber, when she had thought him only a monster. She had been ready to say yes then, before she knew he was the king, before everything had shattered. And now, here he was, asking again, not in the privacy of shadows, but before the entire pack. Not as a king seeking a political alliance, but as a creature, broken, cursed, desperate, offering her everything he had. The council members stood frozen near the platform, their mouths open in protest, but no words came. Killian's face was twisted with barely restrained fury, his hands still hovering near the blade at his side. Milda had retreated to the edge of the crowd, her golden gown torn and her face streaked with tears of humiliation. But none of it mattered. Helena looked into those amber eyes, the same eyes that had watched her sing in the darkness, that had softened when she brushed his fur, that had listened to her hymns as though they were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. And she realized, with a clarity that cut through every doubt and fear, that she loved him. Not the king, not the crown or the throne or the power. The beast, the one who had called her worthy when the world had called her worth less. Helena's voice trembled, but it was steady enough to carry across the silent clearing. Yes. The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward through the crowd. The beast's eyes flared brighter, its massive body shuddering with something that might have been relief or desperation, or both. And then, slowly, it lowered its head further, its muzzle brushing against her tear-streaked face. Helena didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She reached up with trembling hands and touched the beast's face, her fingers sinking into the thick fur, and when the creature's lips met hers, the world exploded into light. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, claiming, a promise written in the language of wolves and sealed under the full moon's gaze. Helena felt the heat of it burn for her chest, felt the beast's massive form trembling against her, felt the raw, unfiltered emotion pouring from the creature into her very soul. And then the light came. It burst from the place where they touched, brilliant, blinding, impossible. Pure white light flooded the clearing, so bright that wolves threw up their hands to shield their eyes, so intense that the torches seemed dim in comparison. Helena gasped into the kiss, her body flooded with warmth, and she felt something inside her shift. Not break. Shift. Like a lock turning, a door opening, something that had been sealed her entire life, finally releasing. The beast roared, not in pain, but in triumph, and the light intensified. The curse shattered. Helena felt it like glass breaking, like chains snapping, like a weight lifting from the world itself. The beast's form convulsed, bones cracking and reshaping, fur receding in waves. The transformation was faster this time, smoother, and within moments, the massive creature was gone. In its place stood Damien. Human. Whole. Free. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his dark hair falling into his eyes. His ceremonial robes hung in tatters around his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice. His hand still cupped Helena's face, his lips still pressed against hers, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes, no longer glowing amber, but their natural deep brown, were filled with something that looked like wonder. "Helena," he whispered, his voice raw and hoarse. But before she could respond, heat flooded her body. Helena gasped, stumbling backward, and Damien caught her instinctively. Her skin burned, her bones ached, and a sensation she had never felt before clawed its way through her chest. Wild, primal, desperate to break free. Her wolf. "No," Helena choked out, her hands clutching Damien's arms. "No, I can't. I've never—" "Let it happen," Damien said urgently, his grip on her steady. "Don't fight it." The pain intensified, and Helena cried out. Her vision blurred, her muscles spasmed, and then the shift tore through her like lightning. Her bones cracked and reformed, her spine arching as her body stretched and reshaped. Fur burst from her skin in thick, dark waves, her hands elongating into powerful paws, her face shifting into a muzzle. The transformation was agony and ecstasy all at once, and when it finally stopped, Helena collapsed forward onto all fours. But she didn't fall. She stood. The clearing erupted in gasps and murmurs, the pack staring in stunned disbelief. Helena's wolf was magnificent. Her fur was dark as midnight, sleek and glossy under the moonlight, with a powerful build that spoke of strength and endurance. Her eyes, still her own, burned like embers, glowing faintly in the darkness. She was larger than most she-wolves, her form elegant and commanding, and when she moved, every muscle rippled with contained power. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She had only been waiting for the one who would see her as whole. Helena turned her head, her glowing eyes finding Damien, and the Alpha King stared at her with an expression that stole her breath. Awe, pride, love. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out slowly, and when his fingers brushed against her fur, Helena felt the bond between them snap into place like a rope pulled taut. Not a fated bond forced by the moon, but something deeper, something chosen. Damien's voice was low, filled with reverence. "You're beautiful." Helena's wolf grumbled softly, leaning into his touch, and for a moment the rest of the world disappeared. Then Damien straightened, his expression hardening as he turned to face the crowd. His hand remained on Helena's head, his posture regal and unyielding, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his authority as Alpha King. "This is your Luna." The words rang out across the clearing like a bell, clear and absolute. Not because fate chose her, not because tradition demanded it, because I did. And anyone who questions that, anyone who opposes her, can challenge me now. Silence. The pack stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and fear. No one moved. No one spoke. Killian's jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His fists were white-knuckled at his sides, his entire body rigid with barely restrained rage. His daughter, his carefully positioned, perfectly poised daughter, had been cast aside for a wolfless servant. And now that servant stood before them as a she-wolf more magnificent than Milda could ever hope to be. His eyes burned with fury, but he did not move. He could not challenge the king openly, not here, not now, not with the entire pack watching and the moon as witness. To do so would be to invite his own destruction. But his expression promised that this humiliation would not be forgotten. Slowly, one by one, the pack began to lower their heads. It started with Darius. The beta stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his scarred face unreadable, and dropped to one knee. His fist pressed against his chest in a gesture of loyalty, and his voice rang out clearly, "My Luna." The elder who had been conducting the ceremony followed, his white robes pooling around him as he knelt. Then the council members, their protests dying on their lips as they bowed their heads in submission. One by one, the wolves of the pack knelt. Some did so willingly, their faces filled with awe. Others hesitated, their gazes flicking toward Killian. But the weight of tradition and the king's authority was too great. They bowed. Milda stood at the edge of the crowd, her golden gown torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears. She looked at Helena with a mixture of disbelief and hatred, her hands trembling at her sides. Then, without a word, she turned and fled into the shadows. Killian remained standing for a moment longer, his cold eyes locked on Helena's wolf form. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head in the barest gesture of submission, but his gaze never wavered, and the promise in his eyes was clear. This is not over. Then he, too, turned and disappeared into the darkness. Damien watched them go, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Helena. He knelt beside her, his hand still resting on her head, and his voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her. "Shift back. I want to see you." Helena hesitated, the wolf's instinct still thrumming through her veins, wild and unfamiliar, but she focused on Damien's voice, on the warmth of his hand, and slowly, carefully, she let the shift reverse. Her bones reformed, her fur receded, and within moments she was human again, naked, trembling, and utterly vulnerable. Damien immediately pulled off the tattered remains of his ceremonial robe and wrapped it around her shoulders, his movements gentle and protective. Helena looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with tears, and Damien cupped her face in his hands. "You were never worthless. You were always mine." Helena's breath hitched, and before she could stop herself, she threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Damien held her tightly, his arms wrapping around her as though he would never let go, and the crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the night. The ceremony was over. The curse was broken. And beneath the silver light of the full moon, the Alpha King and his chosen Luna stood together, whole, free, and finally at peace. But in the darkness beyond the clearing, hidden among the trees, Killian watched. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes fixed on the girl who had ruined everything. His daughter's crown had been stolen, his carefully laid plans had crumbled to dust. His influence over the throne had been undermined by a wolfless servant who should have died in obscurity. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade, his fingers tightening around the leather grip. The king may have claimed her, the pack may have bowed, but Killian was patient. He had spent years maneuvering, calculating, positioning himself for power, and he would not let this humiliation stand. The curse may have been broken, but a new threat was just beginning. Killian's lips curled into a cold, bitter smile as he turned and melted into the shadows, his mind already spinning with plans and vengeance. Helena had won tonight, but the war had only just begun.